collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the can someone tell me how to pronounce this?
Anishinabeg. Anishinabeg.
Sorry if I'm butchering that. Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Okay, so today I want to talk to you about women in the intersection of food and social justice. This is the area that I want to go into as a career, and the closer I get to that, and the more that I tell people and talk to people about what I want to do, the more I realize that for how important I think this issue is, it's really not that well known and not that talked about, and particularly women within this movement. Women have historically been thought of as being in home kitchens, but there's a real big issue with commercial kitchens being male-dominated, and that's something that I've struggled with in jobs that I've had, and figuring out if I want to work in that space. So this is something that's very close to my heart. So first off, I want to explain why I think food is a women's issue. So to start off with, women are more food insecure than men. Every time we look at food insecurity, no matter what community we're looking at, we see that women tend to have much higher rates of food insecurity than men. I think that it's not a coincidence that women still face a pay gap. It's harder to buy food if you don't have as much money. There is not a ton of research to support that, but more just a personal idea of mine. Additionally, nearly twice as many single mother households are food insecure compared to single father households. The WIC program, which is Women, Infant, and Children Food Assistance, kind of like SNAP benefits, food stamps, but specifically for women and children. Their spending as a share of our GDP has been falling since 1997, even though food insecurity has been rising. And 2/3 of adult and senior SNAP recipients, and that's what's commonly referred to as food stamps, are women. So women are being disproportionately affected by food insecurity. There are also many social constructs of why food and women are intrinsically tied, but these are just two that I wanted to touch on. So one, gender roles tell us that mothers are responsible for feeding the family and feeding children, and thus are oftentimes held responsible for nutritional and health outcomes that come from malnutrition and food insecurity. Even though it's obviously not the mother's fault that they can't afford or have access to nutritious food, women are often blamed. And also there's this ridiculous idea that the food movement and nutrition are seen as feminine or just a women's issue. 74% of vegans in the US are women, which I thought was really interesting, and vegetarian men are seen as 35% less masculine than men who eat meat. Absolutely ridiculous, but very bad. It's also women who are facing the consequences. So mothers in food insecure households who receive food assistance are much less likely to develop maternal depression and be in poor health than those who do not receive any food assistance. And food insecurity during pregnancy and youth can have lifelong health, developmental, and educational consequences. We see kids who are developing diabetes, obesity, hypertension. There are lower rates of high school graduation and going on to receive higher education. More instances of contact with the criminal justice system. It really can impact so many aspects of life. And then finally, women make up 60% of lower paying agricultural jobs, but only 1% of agricultural science, engineering, and policy jobs. So even though women are the majority of the agricultural workforce, we're really not represented when it comes to the policies that are regulating our jobs. I also thought it was really interesting. I just learned that,
Thank you.
I just learned that women own or co-own approximately 50% of the farmland in the Midwest. I had no idea. We typically think of farmers and agriculture as being a typically male-dominated field, but in reality, women are very much present. We're just not present in kind of the higher tiers. And then there are dozens of stories like this, probably hundreds of stories, but this is just one of my favorites. So women have historically fed social movements, and Georgia Gilmore was a woman, a chef, an activist, a midwife, and during the civil rights movement, she started selling food out of her home, and she donated all of that money to fund the alternative transportation system in Montgomery during the bus boycotts. She actually testified on behalf of Dr. King, and because of that, she lost her job, and he ended up helping her open a restaurant out of her home, and that became one of his most popular meeting points when he was working during that movement. She was a hugely influential figure, but not a lot of people know about her, and I have never heard her talked about when learning about the civil rights movement. She also, once she became successful in selling food out of her home, she organized other women in the community to do the same, and she created the Club from Nowhere network, which was helping women do the same. So I want to give you a bit of background about the state of food insecurity in specifically the US. So there's this idea of the food justice movement. This is a relatively new movement and fairly grassroots. One definition, which is not my favorite, I'll get to my favorite definition, but the Institute of Agriculture and Trade Policy says that the food justice movement is the right of communities everywhere to produce, process, distribute, access, and eat good food regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, citizenship, ability, religion, or community. So it's just the idea that everybody has the basic right to have access to good, nutritious food. Now, I think a better definition is given by the Portland Multnomah Food Policy Council. They say that the food justice system envisions a food system that is inclusive, community-led, and participatory without the exploitation of people, land, or the environment. Food justice activists seek to establish healthy, resilient communities with equitable access to nourishing and culturally appropriate food. Now, there are a few things that I really like about this definition. One, it talks about not exploiting the people, land, or the environment. This is about people working with the land. It's about sustainable agriculture, not just producing food. And then it also talks about culturally appropriate food. So this is not, this is the idea that, you know, the food in different cultures has a lot of significance and meaning to those cultures and is often a way to express and pass ideas and culture down through generations. And so we need to be sure that when we are providing food and providing that access to healthy foods, that we are working with the community and making sure that the food is appropriate and culturally relevant to that community. The state of food security in the US is not great. 40% of the food that we produce is wasted. That's insane. 1 in 9 Americans, or about 11% of Americans, are food insecure. That's around 37 million Americans, and the majority are either in single-parent homes, rural or urban areas, typically not in suburbs, and in ethnic minority households. In Michigan, the problem is a little bit worse. Here, it's 1 in 8 Michigan households are food insecure. And between 2001 and 2015, that rate has risen by about 5%, from 10% to around 15%. The food insecurity is a growing issue. Part of the issue is how we measure poverty. Sorry, I'm a social work student. I'm gonna nerd out a little bit about this. We measure poverty using a scale that was created by a graduate student named Molly Orshansky in the 1960s. This was just a project. She never intended this to be used for any actual policy, much less national policy. Her scale assumed that households spend about 1/3 of their income on food, which today would put the poverty line at $26,500. That was true back in the 1960s, Today though, the major costs that we have are healthcare, our housing, our transportation. It's not food anymore. So nowadays we actually spend about 1/6 of our income on food, not 1/3, which means that this scale is super outdated and really not accurate at all. The scale also doesn't account for increases in other costs such as housing and transportation and healthcare, and it does account for inflation, but it doesn't account for real price changes in food. So when we're deciding who is below the poverty line and who is in need and who is eligible for SNAP and WIC benefits, we're not using a scale that's actually measuring who is food insecure and who actually needs assistance. The US is also the only developed country that looks at poverty instead of a quality of life index, which measures, it accounts for so much more, and it looks at how easily people can interact with society in all of the different ways. So education, employment, quality of life, mental health. We are just looking at the amount of money that people are making instead of how that money is actually impacting the way that they live. So using more accurate measures, the US has by far the highest poverty rate of any developed country. Don't quote me on this because I'm really bad at remembering numbers, and don't tell my policy teacher I don't remember this, but I believe that the US spends about 0.3% of our GDP on social expenditure, so that's education, food assistance, kind of that whole area of social assistance. Australia spends 60%, and Denmark, I believe, spends 90%. We spend a ridiculously small amount of money on the well-being of our citizens. So the bottom line is food insecurity is because of a lack of affordable food and access to food. It's not about a lack of food. I always go back to that statistic of we waste 40% of the food that is produced in the US. There is plenty of food for everyone. It's just that we're not getting that food to people. So let's look at Detroit. I will say that I moved here 3 months ago, so I'm not as familiar with the maps as you all probably are, but I believe that Metro Detroit is this area right here. So this is a map of Detroit by median household income. So you can see that Detroit, the median household income is significantly lower than a lot of the surrounding areas. If we look at the same area and we look at the percentage of two-parent married households, we can see that Detroit also has a significantly lower rate of two-parent married households than the surrounding area. And then finally, if we look at the percentage of households led by single mothers, we see that there is a high rate of single mother households in Detroit. And then this is a more zoomed in area. I apologize, I couldn't find that same map. But these are food deserts in Detroit. So these are areas where there is not a full grocery store within a 1 mile area, and that 1 mile is the distance that is reasonable for people to walk to a grocery store. I don't want to walk a mile each way to a grocery store, but that's what we have deemed to be the measure of where is a food desert or not. So you can see that there are significant areas of Detroit that are considered food deserts. So by the numbers, 19 neighborhoods in Detroit are considered food deserts by the Michigan Department of Agriculture. 48% of households are food insecure. It means that almost half of the households in Detroit do not have consistent, healthy food. That's 30,000 people who do not have access to a full grocery store. So that means that they are shopping for their daily food out of gas stations or convenience stores. Think about the kind of food that's sold in gas stations and convenience stores. It's not fresh fruits and vegetables. It's not meats and cheeses. We're talking about kids who are eating Cheetos and Easy Mac and juice for dinner every day. Now, 71.5% of families within the Detroit area are single parent households, and 60.1% are single mother households. So if we track back to where I started with food being a women's issue, we see that single mother households are disproportionately food insecure compared to two-parent households and even single father households. Detroit has a huge issue with food insecurity, and it's not just because there aren't enough grocery stores, it's because we have a huge number of single mother impoverished households. When we think about why it's more difficult for single mother households to, or just single parent households really, to be food secure, we're talking about, do I take my kids on public transportation to get to the grocery store and then have them and all of the bags of food to carry back? Do I find childcare, and can I afford to find childcare for those few hours that it's going to take public transportation to the nearest grocery store and get back? Can I get time off of work to go to the grocery store when it's open and when my kids are taken care of? If I've already had to leave work a few times this month to go pick my kid up from school when they're sick, can I take any time off of work to go and get food? Am I working so many jobs that the only time that I have to go grocery shopping is 3 o'clock in the morning where nothing is open? There are so many barriers to getting food, just any food, not even healthy food, that we don't think about that have more to do than just, can I buy the food? So now I want to get a little bit happier. See, this is not the happiest topic, but I want to take a minute to shine a spotlight on 10 of my favorite women and women-run organizations who are working to fight food insecurity or working with food and other social justice movements. These are the women that really inspired me and that have inspired me to go into this field. So the first is Soulfire Farms with Leah Penniman. Soulfire Farms is a Black and Indigenous people of color centered community farm committed to ending racism and injustice in the food system. They're in upstate New York. They have a massive, beautiful, beautiful farm space, and they do a whole bunch of things, from growing food to distribute to local food banks, to racial justice trainings. They do a lot of youth programming, teaching kids sustainable agriculture and healthy food and farming. And they do a lot with food systems and environmental trainings too. Next is Benevolence Farms, founded by Tanya Gisa. They are one of my favorites. They're one county over from where I grew up, doing fantastic work in central rural North Carolina. And their mission is cultivating leadership, promoting sustainable livelihoods, reaping structural change for women impacted by the criminal justice system in North Carolina. So what they do is they have a farm, and on that farm they have a residential program for women who are exiting the criminal justice system. They do not exclude women who have violent offenses or drug offenses, and they, during the residence, they're teaching women business skills, marketing, entrepreneurship, and agricultural education. And part of that is running the Benevolence Farm Body Care line. I encourage you all to check it out. You can order their stuff online, where they sell shampoos and body soaps and lotions that are made and marketed and promoted by the women who are in their program. Next is the FARMS program, Family Agriculture Resource Management Services. So they exist to protect the aging family farmer from abuse through proper legal services while relieving hunger in the farmer's community. So they're helping primarily farmers of color in the Southeast. And Jillian Hishaw, who's the founder, she is a lawyer who helps farmers who have had land passed down through generations to keep that land. A lot of times there are issues with land deeds, especially if the land has been in the family for many, many generations. She also works to help farmers keep their land through financial insecurity, or times of financial insecurity. And then they also have a Farms to Food Banks program, so they're connecting local farmers with the food banks around them so that so that healthy and fresh foods can be distributed. Because a lot of times the foods that are found in food banks are boxed and canned foods. We're not talking about local produce, fresh foods, anything like that. Dr. Marian Nestle, she's awesome. So she's a researcher. She has been an academic for the past 50-ish years. She's a professor, molecular biologist, and public health professional, and her research examines scientific and socioeconomic influences on food choice, obesity, and food safety, with an emphasis on the role of food marketing. So she looks at the way that we are promoting food, particularly to kids, and how the food that we're promoting is not healthy foods. The foods that kids are seeing on TV that they're being advertised is the sugary junk food. It's not healthy foods. If we think about the top agricultural products in the US, corn, soy, those are the things that are being subsidized by the US government. Those are the things that make up the majority of junk food. Chips, Chex-Mix, Goldfish, they're all corn and soy based. And so those are the foods, because they're subsidized by the government, those are the foods that are cheapest and most easily accessible, most widely distributed. Makes sense why we're not advertising, apples and bananas to our kids. It's not subsidized by the government. Marion Nestle also pioneered the first academic food studies program in the US while she was a professor at NYU. So she really wanted food studies to be an area of academia instead of one that was relegated to just the home or the kitchen. Next, we have the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, founded by Dara Cooper. They organize for Black food and land by increasing the visibility and visionary of Black leadership, advancing Black people's struggle for just and sustainable communities, and building power in our food systems and land stewardship. So they do a whole bunch of work, but their focus is really on land justice and food sovereignty. So keeping land that has historically been in Black communities in those communities so that food can be produced by the people that are consuming the food, and we can keep this this sustainable cycle of food production and consumption within the communities. Oh, excuse me. Next, we have the Women's Food and Agricultural Network, or WFAN, founded by Denise O'Brien and Kathy Lawrence. And their mission is to engage women in building an ecological and just food agricultural system through individual and community power. So they are all about networking women in the agricultural community. So they do a lot of support and community building for female farmers. They have farming apprenticeships for women, and they do a lot of conservation and agricultural education. We have the Feed 'em Freedom Growers, founded by Mama Myrtle Curtis. She is in Detroit. This is a local organization, and her slogan is "Grow a Garden, Grow a Community." So she's been establishing farms, small farms in and around Detroit, and using the produce that is harvested from those farms, she's leading healthy cooking classes for kids in the community. So she does a lot with developing relationships through gardening and food. She really tries to bring the neighborhoods where she creates these gardens together to produce their own food and then learn to cook with it. And she has all sorts of youth programming, which I really love. Lots of after-school programs. Jasmine Cho is one of my favorite people in the world. I talk about her all the time. She calls herself a cookie activist. She has a bakery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and what she does is she creates cookie portraits. That's a cookie. I'm so impressed. I bake all the time. I can't do anything like this. But she creates cookie portraits of Asian American figures. Growing up, she talks a lot about how growing up there wasn't any Asian American representation for her. And so she really wanted to inspire kids, Asian American kids, by creating these sweet treats that represent important figures in their community. She also is a current master's student as well, so that she can become an art therapist and do baking therapy. Food therapy, cooking therapy has been used in eating disorder treatments before, but it hasn't really been spread to other groups, other areas of practice. This is something that I'm really interested in doing. I think that there's a lot about cooking and baking that is applicable for really everyday life. You know, you're learning how to focus on one task and follow instructions and really see something through from start to finish. It's a creative medium. It is, you know, you're literally nourishing yourself, you're feeding yourself. That's a form of self-care. I think that baking therapy could be helpful for such a wide range of people, and it's absolutely been helpful in my life. And then Neza Bendel, she's also in Detroit. Could not for the life of me find a picture of her. But she is a vegan chef who cooks for Detroit's racial equity movement. So she'll cook huge meals and bring them out to the racial equity protesters in and around Detroit. And she cooks healthy versions of classic soul food. So this is circling back to the cultural appropriateness of the food. She is cooking food that, for this community, is very appropriate. You know, she's not going in with food that's totally foreign, and that's comforting. That's a way of communicating. And she has a great quote that you can't fight a revolution if you're hungry or malnourished. Our community can't reach its full potential if we're eating hot Cheetos for breakfast. Love this quote. And then finally, there's Emma's Torch, which is a restaurant and organization in New York City, founded by Carrie Brody. And their mission is to empower refugees, asylees, and survivors of human trafficking through culinary education. They do a 6-month paid culinary internship for refugees and asylees. And part of that is weekly ESL classes as well as job interview training. By the time the participants graduate from the program, they have a pretty complete culinary education, and the restaurant helps place them with other restaurants nearby, so they do a lot of job placement, and I believe they have a 98% job placement rate, which is really incredible. So they're placing their graduates in mostly high-end restaurants that pay a living wage. So inspired by Emma's Torch, there's my dream. If I ever win the lottery, if any of you want to fund me, I would love to have a nonprofit residential organization for LGBTQ young adults. This would look similar to the Emma's Torch, except the residency would be a little longer. I'm thinking 1 to 3 years. And it would give the participants an opportunity to work in the restaurant and receive paid job training. They could either work front of house or back of house, so even if they're not interested in the cooking side, they can learn the more business and marketing skills up front. And this would also be a space to fight food insecurity in the queer population. Queer youth particularly have a much, much higher rate of homelessness than their straight cis counterparts. And so food insecurity is an issue that is disproportionately affecting LGBTQIA+ individuals. So now I want to turn it all to you. So I want you to think about a social justice movement that you're passionate about, and think about how it's impacted by food security, and how could you incorporate elements of the food justice movement into your movement that you're passionate about. I would love for you to take a minute to think about that and then share with the people at your table.
Is everyone still thinking? Are you still thinking? Oh, okay. Take it away.
Alright, is this project that I'm working on?
So I'm actually a English student, so my frame is a little slightly different, but
lot of people remember,
pets are extremely important, like animal welfare is one of my interests, and being able to provide, food for this member of the family, is super important when, you're having access, crippling access, healthy foods yourself. There'll be, you can't have a grocery store near you, there's probably not a pet store near you. So being able to bring those same impacts of being able to provide access to the needed resources to feed all members of the family.
Specifically mothers, I'm interested in
to push the government to emphasize and encourage all the countries and adopt this group economy.
Alright, you got it, girl. Do it. Where's home for you?
Tanzania.
Tanzania.
Okay, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Tabitha. I'm Tanzanian, from Tanzania. Together with my parents, we're in a fellowship program in Nigeria to encourage exchange program to get fellows from little agriculture integration cohort. We get to